In a hangar at Baikonur, a space shuttle sits crushed under its own collapsed roof. Not from war, not from age, from neglect. A few hundred miles away, a nuclear power plant stands with cooling towers, control rooms, even reactor domes. But no reactor was ever installed. On a beach near the Caspian Sea, a machine shaped like a plane and a ship rusts in the sand, once nicknamed a sea monster by American spies. All of it was built by one country to prove its future was permanent. That country collapsed before some of these projects were even finished. The Soviet Union didn't just want to survive the Cold War. It wanted to outlast it, outbuild it, prove that communism could out-engineer capitalism at every scale, from low orbit to the Arctic tundra to the ocean floor. So it built enormous things, expensive things, things designed to outlive the men who ordered them, engineered for a permanence that history had other plans for. Most of them didn't make it past 1991. Some didn't even make it that far. Start at Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, where the USSR built its answer to the American space shuttle. It was called Buran, and it looked almost identical to NASA's design, close enough that some Western analysts assumed it was simply a copy. But there is one difference nobody could dismiss. In 1988, Buran flew into orbit, circled the Earth, and landed itself on a runway, fully automated, with no crew aboard at all. NASA's shuttle, after 3 decades and well over 100 missions, never once managed a fully unmanned landing. On paper, the Soviets had just out-engineered the Americans at their own game. It should have been the beginning of a program. Instead, it was the only flight Buran ever made. The project had already consumed a staggering share of the Soviet space budget, developed in parallel with a booster rocket system, ground infrastructure, and an entire training program for cosmonauts who never got to fly it. By the time Buran proved the technology worked, the country funding it was running out of money to prove anything else. The USSR collapsed in 1991. The orbiters, along with test articles and unfinished sister ships, were rolled into a hangar at Baikonur and left there, waiting for a second flight that funding could no longer support. In 2002, the hangar roof gave out. It collapsed directly onto the one orbiter that had actually flown, destroying it completely and killing workers who were inside at the time. A spacecraft engineered to survive the violence of atmospheric re-entry could not survive its own storage building. The wreckage is still there today. Other unfinished orbiters sit nearby, exposed to weather, occasionally photographed by explorers granted special access to the site. A program built to prove the future belonged to the Soviets ended as scrap metal, crushed under a hole in a roof nobody bothered to repair. One machine was built to leave the Earth. The next thing on this list never even got the chance to fail properly. It was finished, and it still never worked. Near Shulkin, on the Crimean coast, there's a nuclear power plant with everything a functioning plant needs: cooling towers, reactor domes, turbine halls, control rooms wired and ready. Everything, in fact, except a reactor. Construction was reportedly close to completion. Some estimates put it near 80%, when work simply stopped in the late 1980s. The reason wasn't money, at least not at first. It was Chernobyl. After the 1986 disaster, public trust in Soviet nuclear projects collapsed almost overnight, and officials pulled back from finishing new reactor sites across the country, this one included. Then the Soviet economy failed anyway, and there was no funding left to finish the job even if anyone had changed their mind. The plant never generated a single watt of power. What it generated instead was a strange kind of afterlife. Reports describe its empty turbine halls, later hosting techno parties and film shoots, an industrial cathedral built for one purpose and used, unofficially, for almost anything else. A building meant to prove nuclear confidence became a monument to nuclear fear, standing fully built and completely useless in a country that no longer wanted what it was designed to make. That plant failed because people became afraid of the future. The next one failed because somebody changed their mind after the concrete had already been poured, and the ground itself refused to cooperate. In Moscow, Soviet planners demolished a 19th century cathedral to clear space for something bigger than any building on Earth. Not just tall, the tallest structure ever proposed anywhere, topped with a statue of Lenin so enormous it would have dwarfed the Statue of Liberty several times over. It was called the Palace of the Soviets, and it was designed as a secular temple, a monument meant to replace religious worship with worship of the state itself. Construction began in the 1930s. Then World War II diverted every ounce of available steel to the war effort, and the half-built frame was dismantled for scrap to build tank obstacles and bridges. After the war, engineers reportedly ran into a second problem. The massive foundation pit kept flooding with groundwater, a complication some accounts treat as the final blow, and others frame as just one factor among several political and economic ones. Whatever the deciding cause, the palace was never built. Only the foundation existed, a colossal hole in the middle of Moscow. So the Soviets turned the hole into the largest open-air heated swimming pool in the world, steam rising off the water even in the depths of winter. It stayed that way for decades, a strange public landmark built from the wreckage of a canceled monument. Then, after the USSR fell, the original cathedral was reconstructed almost exactly on the same spot it had stood before Soviet planners tore it down. The site, built to erase religion with concrete ideology, now holds the very church it was designed to replace, standing today as if the interruption in between had never happened. That failure took decades to fully reverse. The next one on this list never stopped costing money. It just kept spreading, quietly, across an entire country. Stretching more than 2,700 miles across Siberia, the Baikal-Amur mainline was meant to be a second Trans-Siberian Railway, a strategic backup route running through some of the most brutal terrain on the planet, cutting through permafrost, mountain ranges, and territory where almost nothing had ever been built before. Soviet planners promised the railway would unlock Siberia's mineral resources and seed a string of new industrial cities along the tracks, transforming empty wilderness into a modern frontier. The line did get built eventually, through decades of extreme labor in extreme conditions. But the boomtowns never fully arrived. Factories that were supposed to spring up along the route stayed small, or stayed empty, or never opened at all. Estimates of the total cost vary widely and remain disputed among historians, but many consider it one of the most expensive infrastructure projects the Soviet Union ever attempted. And for years after completion, trains ran along it at a small fraction of the capacity it had been engineered for. A railway designed to future-proof an empire instead helped drain the resources of the empire it was meant to protect, one budget cycle at a time, for almost 20 years. That project ate money slowly, quietly, over decades. The next one tried to build an entire functioning society almost overnight in one of the harshest environments on the planet. On the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, hundreds of miles inside the Arctic Circle, the Soviets built a coal mining town called Pyramiden. It had a cultural palace, an indoor swimming pool, a grand piano shipped in specifically because a proper Soviet town needed one, and the northernmost statue of Lenin anywhere on Earth. Soil was imported by the ton so that grass could grow on Arctic ground where nothing was supposed to grow at all. It was designed as living proof that Soviet ideology and Soviet engineering could conquer any environment on the planet, including one of the most hostile places humans have ever tried to settle. For a while, it actually worked. People lived there, raised children there, worked the mines, and came home to a town with music halls and heated buildings. Then, the coal became too expensive to extract as easier reserves ran out, and when the Soviet economy collapsed at the state level, the subsidies that had been quietly keeping the entire town alive disappeared along with it. In 1998, the town was abandoned, reportedly with such speed that furniture, books, and personal belongings were left behind exactly where people had last set them down. It now sits as a frozen time capsule, open only to guided tours, a fully built Soviet town preserved not by any deliberate choice, but by cold. That utopia failed in silence, in the snow, far from any witnesses. The next structure failed loudly and ended up swallowed by the worst nuclear disaster in history. Hidden near the Ukrainian border, disguised on Soviet maps as a children's summer camp and an agricultural research station, stood a radar structure over 500 feet tall and nearly a mile long. It was called Duga, and Western intelligence nicknamed it the Russian woodpecker because the radio interference it generated disrupted shortwave broadcasts across the entire world, an interference so persistent that amateur radio operators everywhere learned to recognize its signature. Its real job was detecting incoming American nuclear missiles before they could strike, one critical piece of the Soviet Union's early warning system against a first strike. The system itself was notoriously unreliable, plagued by false readings and interference problems it was supposed to solve, not cause, and it sat only a few miles away from another enormous Soviet structure, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. When Chernobyl exploded in 1986, the entire surrounding region was evacuated, including Duga's secret support town, known as Chernobyl 2, home to the soldiers and technicians who ran the radar. A machine built to spot an incoming catastrophe was ultimately abandoned because of a catastrophe built right next door to it. It still stands today, inside the exclusion zone, one of the strangest structures accessible on official Chernobyl tours, a machine designed to watch the skies for the end of the world, left behind by an ending nobody there was watching for. That secret was simply too massive to hide. The next Soviet gamble was too strange to even categorize properly. On the shore of the Caspian Sea, Soviet engineers built something that was neither a plane nor a boat, though it borrowed from both. It was called an ekranoplan, a vehicle the size of an airliner that skimmed just above the water surface at extreme speed, riding on a cushion of air trapped between its wings and the sea. American analysts spotted it on satellite imagery years before anyone understood what it actually was, and reportedly nicknamed it the Caspian Sea Monster. It was designed to move troops and missiles across water fast enough and low enough to slip beneath both naval radar and air defense systems entirely, but the technology proved extremely difficult to control at scale, and a full production fleet of these vehicles never materialized the way planners had hoped. The lead prototype was eventually lost in an accident, details of which remain disputed, and when Soviet funding dried up, along with everything else, the program quietly ended. Remaining hulls were left rusting on the Caspian shoreline for years, half buried in sand, before some were eventually recovered and moved to museum display. A vehicle engineered specifically to be undetectable became instead one of the most visually bizarre, unmistakable wrecks of the entire Cold War, impossible to look at and not ask questions. That machine was built to move fast and stay hidden. The last place on this list wasn't built to be found at all, and what it eventually left behind wasn't concrete, it was contamination. In the middle of the Aral Sea once sat an island, chosen for exactly one reason: total isolation. On it, Soviet scientists ran one of the country's most secretive bioweapons testing programs for decades, working with agents including anthrax, on a strip of land surrounded by water on every side, far from any prying eyes, foreign or domestic. Then the isolation itself disappeared. Soviet irrigation projects had spent decades draining the rivers that fed the Aral Sea in order to grow cotton across Central Asia, and as the water receded year after year, so did the sea surrounding the island. By the 2000s, what had once been an isolated island in open water was simply connected to dry land, walkable from the mainland without a boat. The Soviet Union collapsed before the testing site could be properly decontaminated. Some reports pointed to lingering risk from buried burial pits containing live spores, claims that remained disputed but taken seriously enough that later international efforts worked to clean up what could still be found. The empire had built an island prison specifically for its most dangerous secrets. Then, without meaning to, it drained the exact water that had made the island a prison in the first place. A shuttle that proved itself once, brilliantly, then rotted for over a decade under its own collapsing roof. A nuclear plant that never made power but somehow still hosts a crowd on weekends. A palace that became a swimming pool, then quietly gave its foundation back to the exact church it was built to replace. A railway that helped bankrupt the country it was supposed to save. A town in the Arctic, abandoned mid-sentence, its furniture still arranged for people who never came back. A radar built to watch for one apocalypse, abandoned by an entirely different one closer to home. A machine too strange to be mistaken for anything else humans have ever built. an island that lost the sea, protecting its darkest secret. None of this was random, and none of it was accidental in the way it turned out. Each project was approved because someone with real power believed a specific future was coming and was willing to spend almost anything the state had to get there first. The future they were building for never arrived. But in a hangar at Baikonur, under a collapsed roof, exposed to wind and weather more than 30 years later, the shuttle built to prove it is still sitting there.